Hi, and welcome to the Northern Myths podcast, where we explore the myths and legends of Northern Europe from an archetypal perspective. I'm Dan Larrabee.
And I'm Luke DeWolf.
So before we get into today's episode, if you like the Northern Myths podcast and want to help us out, be sure to check us out on Facebook and on Twitter at Northern Myths. We're on YouTube as well. Maybe you thought we were just a podcast, but we also have videos. Northern Myths podcast. It would be awesome if you liked and shared it. You can find all of our episodes on YouTube as well as clips throughout the week. And we're also on Instagram, so be sure to follow us there at Northern Myths podcast and like and share whatever we put up there. And there's always clips, there's always good stuff there. And it would really help us out to get us out there and to get more people listening. So thank you very much. And with that being done, I would like to welcome our guest today, Fjörn the Skald, the host of the podcast Fjörn's Hall, as well as a pretty awesome website with tons of information on sagas and myths and sort of the language of Old Norse. So Fjörn, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. You guys have a great podcast.
Oh, you do too. This is actually, we're looking forward to this. I was actually just listening to your latest podcast just before this started about the polar bear with the rosy cheeks. And I'd never heard of this story before, so it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, it's one of those that gets forgotten about by most people, even in scholarship. When the book that I recommend throughout that episode, even Miller himself is like, I'm hoping the polar bear will actually help this story become noticed a little bit, except from people who are in the minor field of Icelandic studies.
Yeah, we're really happy to have you here, Fjörn, and I guess you've been covering some of these somewhat lesser known stories on your podcast. Before we hand it over to you a little bit to give it a little bit more of an intro, but that's been really cool to see on your show. A little bit less widely known and widely traveled stories.
Yeah, unfortunately, those are the ones I love the most. And I don't always get a lot of public support, but you got to start somewhere. And I think people will really like them if they just know about them.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they're super interesting. And, you know, we all know of some of Thor's adventures where he's smashing giants and that kind of thing. Like, that's a pretty normal thing. Or Odin doing some terrible things to people for knowledge. But like these sort of more obscure ones, they're super interesting. And I guess that's a good leeway into, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you came to love the sagas and Norse mythology and how you got into these obscure and awesome stories.
Well, it all started kind of in a very non-professional way. There was a summer. I had recently become a history major, but I thought I wanted to do classics like Roman history and such. Which I'd still find fascinating. But over the summer, I just found myself wanting to play Skyrim a lot, to be honest. And it just didn't feel right to play as the Imperials as much as I thought it would be. But to get back to things, I found myself on Pinterest, actually, scrolling through people's pins about Vikings. And most of them are terribly inaccurate, but they're fun. And then I eventually made a Tumblr blog, which is where everything really started for me in that regard. But what really got me going was when I took a Viking history class at my university. And we kind of just surveyed who the Vikings were. And the first half of the class was about their culture. And that's something you don't always hear about, especially in media, because you just hear about their raids and whatnot. So it was really, really inspiring for me to take that class, and it opened up my eyes to their literature. Because the semester after that, I did an independent study with one of my professors. And we read Njál's saga. Now that's a beefy saga.
That is.
It doesn't have any dragon slaying in it, so it's not always the one that people enjoy. But I really fell in love with that, and now I find myself studying those types of sagas a lot to kind of learn about the society that told those stories and more. And that kind of ended up being expressed through a blog because, as I said, that's really where I kind of expressed my interest through that. And I just kept blogging about it and wanted more people to read this material and to know the other side of the Vikings, the stories they told. And I really find those stories to be something valuable, even for us today. And I think you guys would definitely agree with that, especially the mythology side.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I like that. That's the attitude that seems to be coming to the surface these days. Not just with us, but with yourself and with a lot of other people that we've kind of all gotten in contact with lately. It's been this idea that we can take these stories and apply them and learn from them. And I really like the way your website is organized, because it's almost it's not even just a blog. You've got a lot of very practical information and all sourced and everything that people can find. That must have taken you a long time to kind of delve into all that and compile all those sources.
Yeah, unfortunately, it really does take a lot of time, and it's made worse by the fact that I'm a graduate student, and I am also a graduate assistant. So not only do I have my own papers to write, my own classes to take, but I'm also helping professors with their classes and grading their papers. And then I have to come home and try and work on my blog and podcast. And it's a very difficult thing to balance, but it's still worth it. I really love that I can do all of it. And the academic side of my things, even though it keeps me busy, it really helps me put that kind of material out there for other people. And I think that's one of the things I really want to keep doing, even though I keep piling more projects on myself, such as a podcast. I think it's important to give other people some research opportunities that aren't necessarily able to access the materials that I can.
Absolutely. I mean, what's the use of learning all this if you aren't going to be able to share it, right? It's not doing too much good just locked up in your own head.
Yeah, and one of my favorite things, and I don't know if you guys have seen any of my lore tomes, but mentioning where the gods get brought up or aspects of Norse lore gets brought up in non-traditional sources. Like, most people go straight to the Eddas, and that's a great place to start, but you can sometimes get little bits and pieces elsewhere in like the sagas or the Book of Settlements. You can get a lot about land spirits, for example, in the Book of Settlements. And of course, you have the problem about it's coming through a Christian author, but really what isn't? I mean, most of our written sources do, and we just have to kind of deal with that fact.
No, of course. When we spoke to Professor Caroline Larrington about this, she was very adamant about how Snorri Sturluson, we talked about Snorri specifically, how he and his contributions, the possibly the worst that he did was kind of smooth some things over and make the whole system kind of fit a little bit better. I think her detail, one of her examples was something like finding someone for Tyr to fight at Ragnarok. That was the detail, right? I think that was it. Yeah. The other side to him was that, when he makes changes and all that, sometimes it's very obvious, such as the intro to the Prose Edda, where the gods are theoretically from Troy, right? So the contributions of these Christian authors, at worst, what they did was save all this incredibly valuable history and mythology, and at worst, maybe they had a little bit of bias and a little bit of a lens from a different religious perspective, but they still saved all this stuff, and that's incredibly valuable.
Yeah, and when you read these sources, if you understand the perspective they're coming from, you can kind of weed it out and kind of figure out where they've changed some things and how they've treated the material. So it's not like it's completely spoiled. And I'm glad you brought that up, and that Dr. Larrington said that too, because I think people need to know that, because I've seen so many people that really hate on Snorri. I mean, there's a lot to hate, because some people like to say he just Christianized all this mythology, but he actually did a very good job. And without him, there's a lot of stories we wouldn't know anything about.
Absolutely. I would say too, in some ways, he Christianized it enough so that he wouldn't be killed over it. He was just sort of doing maybe not the bare minimum, but enough that he wouldn't get in trouble for recounting these myths and these heathen pagan gods that these poor turned around people had before the Christians came in. So
something that's interesting about that too is what he did isn't that much different from what we do today. Like, he just took mythology and made it relevant for his audience, which had been Christian for over 200 years. And that's something that even I know from a historian point of view, we take history and we reinterpret it. And we don't really remove ourselves from that interpretation. And we have to make it relevant to our modern audience. I mean, we're not all sitting in a Viking Age hall when we're reading the Norse mythology, and we want it to be valuable to us today in the world that we live in today. And that's exactly what he was doing, because he saw skaldic poetry on decline, and he wanted to make sure that they could still use this material. And so he made it relevant for his own society. And that's something I think that's valuable in and of itself.
Well, exactly. And I mean, it's funny if you were to make that comparison, but I like that from your perspective, how you say that, historians are interpreting, these facts or sources, or however you want to put that. I never thought of it that way, to be honest, as far as, how historians or whatever it is that we do, because we're certainly not experts by any means. I mean, I would say you probably have a one up on us just for having so much more education on this stuff specifically. But at a minimum, we're trying to do something in the same spirit, right?
Mm-hmm. And the only real difference, like with historians, and I'm sure there are definitely a few professors that would get on me for making it sound like we just make things up, because we don't. We use a lot of fact, and we really are careful about how we interpret things. But in reality, it's an interpretation. I mean, we can't be completely factual. There really is no absolute truth. There's no one way of spinning things. And the things that we ask ourselves, and what's interesting about old material, is really because of what we're interested in our own time. When we go to these materials and we ask ourselves, oh, this aspect of society is really interesting. I wonder if this was true. It's really because we're playing on something that we experience today, and we want to find answers that kind of help explain that. So there really is no point of hiding the fact that we are really attached to our own time, and our interpretations reflect that to some extent. I mean, that history is always changing, because so is the society of the historian.
That's a really good point. And, I guess what that brings me to, I suppose, here is what do you see as your role in kind of understanding and interpreting these stories? Like what, maybe what am I getting at here? What have you found since you've been exploring all this stuff, as far as how it has affected your life? What have you drawn from these myths, stories, whatever you want to call them, and brought into your own life?
Well, as an academic, usually what I look at is how these stories tell us about their society, or at least what we can imagine that they tell about their society. For example, in Volsunga Saga, there's a lot of issues about marriage not working out the way it should be. The kin groups that try and unite themselves through marriage ends up being failed, and you kind of get the sense that the saga itself is criticizing that, at least of its own society, and how those connections aren't working well for them as well, even though they're telling it in a very mythical time that doesn't really have a place, or loosely has a place, in real historical time. But I'd say, personally, the other side of that is that this material really kind of changes the way you look at the world, and sometimes the way you think of certain things, and you can draw lessons from them that aren't necessarily lessons that the audience would have in the medieval period, but sometimes you can use the stories to kind of reflect on your own life, or even your own approach to things. It's kind of hard to really condense into a very simple statement, but when you read a story about trying to say stories that people would be familiar with, but like, for example, with Njal Saga, I know most people haven't read that, but it's very legal oriented, and in the end, the law kind of fails everybody. But it's that looking like what's really important is it maintaining the law or helping your friends? Because one thing that Njal does is he bends the law to help his friends, but it's usually the morally good thing. And it's just, I think all that has messages that you can apply to your life, whether that's something that a medieval audience would have thought or not. And I often take these stories and kind of reflect on my own place, and I sometimes use them even as analogies to kind of figure out what would I do in that case, or, that's interesting. I can see that aspect of this in our own world today, and that could be a problem that people explore. And it's funny when you look back at a source and you kind of see it dealing with the same exact problems that we are today, and you can really use that to reflect on yourself and even your place in society or the world around you.
We've certainly had had that exact thought, I think, multiple times. It's funny whenever we're looking at some story, and even on the first reading, it's not necessarily apparent how it connects, but then we start discussing it together, and it ends up being, wow, like the connections and the parallels that we start to see become very, very clear, and it's really fascinating to see that.
I think one example, and it's actually one of my favorite stories from Norse myth. It's actually from the Prose Edda, so anyone can throw their rocks at me if they will. But it's the one where Thor and Loki go to Utgarda Loki, and it's a lot of humor, but it really it shows how even Thor has difficulties sometimes, because I mean, of course, he's being deceived by magic, but even he has difficulty doing these challenges, and then at the end, it's revealed that these are challenges like fighting against old age. It's something we all struggle with, and we can do our best, but even Thor has trouble competing against old age, or even like when Loki is trying to eat as fast as he can. He can't win against wildfire, something that consumes anything faster than most things can. And aspects of stories like that really goes to show that human side of the gods, in a sense, in that we can relate to them even now, and how they can kind of show us that even the gods have trouble sometimes. And even the mightiest of the gods, being Thor, has to try hard and sometimes doesn't always succeed. And I think it encourages us even that sometimes you won't win right away, but at least you did better than most people could, or you did your best.
Absolutely. And I think too, it shows that even the gods are subject to certain laws of the universe that they're just not going to be able to overcome. And in our day and age, I think that's something that every now and then it'd be worth being reminded of for us, because I mean, we have all this incredible technology, but maybe there's some things that, like, even with this technology, that we can't do and maybe shouldn't be able to do because of the immutable laws of the universe.
The thing that I really enjoy about that story is that well, first of all, the metaphors are very clear, first of all, when they're enunciated, but at the time it's kind of like it's the blindness we have to these struggles that are kind of going on. It's almost like you can't the forest for the trees, that's the expression, right? Like you can't see the big picture when you're kind of wrapped up in it. And maybe one message there is something like, taking the time to really see what's going on around you and to understand what you're actually up against at any one time. And yeah, old age being kind of one example, right? Like that's definitely not something that you can fight against, but I think we spend a lot of our time specifically trying to stave that off. And maybe some things are more beneficial than others, like trying to be healthy or work out or have a healthy diet or something like that. But others are just snake oil sort of things.
Yeah, actually, I never thought about the tale like that, but I really like it, where it's the troubles that we face are sometimes disguised to us, and we don't always fully understand them while we're dealing with them. It's kind of that sense of you can probably relate it back to their sense of fate and how the world will just go as it will, and you're kind of just a victim to it. But at the same time, you can still try your best and do what you can despite the difficulties of it.
That's a really good enunciation of their concept of fate, because it can be hard, I think, for me especially, to come to grips with the idea that the concept of fate for the Norse was not necessarily deterministic per se, as in some of the modern senses of determinism, where we actually get kind of a scientific backing to it, where it's like, our brain chemicals are working in such and such a way, and we would make these decisions kind of regardless, just because this is the way the simulation is working or something like that. But it still comes down to a sort of deterministic sense where it's like your fate is set, and you can't necessarily do anything about that. But I like the nuance you bring up there, because I think it's incredibly important to understand that you still have to do your best within that.
Yeah, and I think this is one of those moments where reading the saga literature that's not necessarily very mythological and sometimes very realistic, like the family sagas from Iceland, actually helps you read the mythology in a little bit of a different way. Because the Prose Edda, for example, was written contemporary with a lot of saga literature. And sometimes you actually start to see those parallels of the themes that they explore in their society of what you can see in the myths. Of course, the myths we like to try and think that they came from a long, older period. And of course they did, but they kind of evolved and took on meanings of the society telling them. So when we see it, even in the 13th century, it's interesting how much parallels you can draw between their society and their sagas, which deal a lot with the concepts of fate. And it's probably only really from that I would ever think to apply that concept of fate to the way that the sagas are going, like with Thor.
Yeah, it's interesting there in terms of we are currently going through, and very slowly, I might add, more of the mythological material, mostly because that's what you start with if you're wanting to look at the mythology per se. But we want to get to the sagas eventually. And I mean, unfortunately, it's going to take us a very long time, although you could also say that that's kind of a feature of what we're doing. We're taking a while to get into it, but that's why what you're doing, I think, is also so complimentary. I think we were just saying something like all the podcasts and podcasters that we've been kind of getting in touch with, and there are others that we'll mention kind of later, but it's all valuable to touch on so many different things. And I really love that you've been covering kind of these less known stories much more deeply than the ones that are more well known there.
Yeah, and I think it's really nice and important that we all kind of function as a community together, and we all offer our own special things. And I think it's actually better for the audience at large to, when they listen to all of us and put us all into conversation in their own heads, it's actually kind of great because we offer so many different perspectives and we bring up so many different materials. Like, I honestly did not think about the story of Utgard or Loki like that until we sat down and talked about it together. And you guys have your own perspective and I have mine. And when they come together, we have this rich discussion. And I think that's what a lot of the audience can get when they listen to all our different podcasts and bring them together in their own minds.
Absolutely. I think it helps flesh out these ideas and it kind of shows, that these stories, like we've been saying all along, still have meaning for a modern audience. I wanted to go back a little bit to what you're mentioning about the myths that were being written sort of in a contemporary setting to the saga literature. And I was wondering if you'd get into that a bit more about some of the ideas that you would see in the myths showing up in the society that's presented in the sagas.
Yeah. I think the most obvious would be Volsunga Saga, if we decide to count his heroic legends as part of the mythology. But really, when you read Volsunga Saga and you think of how a family saga is written, for example, they really are very similar. Like, Volsunga Saga starts off with the previous generations. So you have his father Sigmund and his father King Volsung, and a lot of the themes that happen in the beginning part end up mirroring in later parts. And that's exactly the same pattern you see in the sagas about Icelandic families and other Icelanders, where you'll have the first couple generations doing these great things, and then it repeats. But also, it's almost feuding that is happening in Volsunga Saga between the kings that they're trying to marry into, the other families they're trying to marry into, and the families that are like giving their daughter away. And then they're not coming together like they should. And that was a very real problem. And society, like Icelandic society, was actually dealing with things like that. And a lot of their other sagas really dive into that same theme. So it's really interesting when you see the same thing come up, except this time it's got Odin giving a sword to this family, which swords like that do pop up in less mythological sagas as well. And you really do see those themes about feud coming up. And sometimes you see comments even in the Prose Edda about how, back to that Utgarda Loki story with Thor, when he's at that house with his goats and he kills his goats to have them eat because he can kill his goats, eat them, and resurrect them the next day, but only if the bones aren't broken. So when one of the children of that, or I don't remember who breaks one of the bones from the goat, but when Thor goes up the next morning to resurrect his goats, one of them has a lame leg, so it's limping. And Thor gets angry because he realized someone broke a bone. And as compensation, he takes the two children and they end up becoming his bondservants. But that notion of compensation, which of course is older than the 13th century when Snorri wrote this, but it was still something that was part of Icelandic society at that time. Just those little comments about how even the gods have to receive compensation for things like that is kind of one of those ways that the society that's telling these tales is actually showing up in the mythology as well. Because there's a lot of cases where the gods they seem subject to the same laws as the society, but that's really just society reflecting itself in its lore.
You know, that particular story with Thor and the goats there is one of my favorites because it's evidence of one of the oldest strains of mythological thought and understanding that we have. It's actually the primary example that Mircea Eliade uses when he's talking about extant examples of ancient cults of wild beasts, like the Lord of Wild Beasts, which is sort of a more hypothetical concept that would have been practiced by hunter societies, and would have eventually been superseded by agricultural religion and then into the mythologies that we get into today. But it's the offerings that they would have left at the time. The archaeological evidence we have anyway is that the long bones, so the legs and the arms, and the skulls of animals would be left as offering. And the implication, I think, was also that the brains and the marrow, which would have been, first of all, incredibly nutrient rich and, well, very caloric, like very, very good for you sort of thing, give you a lot of energy. That is what they would have offered, the best parts of the animal, in the hopes of it being resurrected. And just to see that all the way through the mythology into, again, up to the 13th century here, it's amazing that stuff survives so long. And that's why I really, really like that story. But everything else you bring into this about the compensation and how that affects the society and all that is just as important. But I really love that story for that reason.
No, and you bring up a good point of how stories, especially in the Norse world, I find, and other societies, they really are this continually evolving thing. They do keep a lot of those really old elements. At least the society telling it like 300 years later may not consciously be aware of it, but it just kind of sticks around. And I know some people in the past have taken that as, oh, these stories are historical truths. Everything that happened here is exactly how it used to be. But in reality, it's just like, it's like a snowball coming off of a mountain. It starts with something that used to happen, and then people keep telling the story, and it adds and adds, and you have these new details that come in, or maybe the society doesn't remember where that detail came from, but it sticks around because it used to be there, but they add new things. And sometimes I do wonder, I haven't really gotten into the scholarship of it, but how those themes with Sigurd, like the second half of the story especially, how much of that was added later on, it's hard to say, but it's really important that we consider these tales as those long arching tales, especially with the mythology, because they weren't just made up in the 13th century when they were recorded. I'd rather look at it more as a retelling, if nothing else, that has been embedded with new meaning, but still keeps much of the old.
Oh, definitely. And I know that as groups of people or tribes are sort of understanding the world around them and how the world works, and you can see it at the level of children as well. They societies and children will sort of act out a certain aspect of life before they sort of understand it. And after they act it out, they'll retell the story of kind of acting it out in the hopes and sort of in the process of understanding it, until the point where they have this story it's literally developed over generations where for children, as they mature, until finally they can actually explain what's going on in it. And it sort of goes from this abstract play story idea to like sort of firm concepts that they can actually express and articulate. And I think you absolutely have to look at the mythology and the stories like that too, because you're right, they didn't just fall out of the sky in the 13th century. They've developed, and as society developed, there's new and deeper understandings to all of these aspects of the stories.
And I like that example of a child. That's a good one, especially because you could almost relate how, as the child has new experiences, they perceive the story with new experiences as well, and kind of it adds to it, and it kind of grows with them as well.
Absolutely, it's like kids who are playing house, and they're, one's a mommy and one's a daddy, and they don't really understand what they're doing, but they've witnessed enough that they can sort of act it out. But there's no deeper understanding, but as they grow up, they start understanding exactly what they're acting out means, and all the sort of complex parts that go into being, mommy and daddy and that kind of thing.
If you go with that analogy, we can ask ourselves a difficult question to answer. Would we consider Snorri as having that understanding?
Do you mean the understanding of the ideas that he's talking about, or like he's just sort of mimicking them onto paper via writing? Is that what you're getting at?
As in, like, did he just record it, or did he actually really understand the meanings behind these stories and their usefulness beyond just, making obscure references in skaldic poetry? Of course, he does say we're not supposed to believe this anymore. But did he have that deeper understanding of what these tales really served as beyond just their poetic relevance?
I think we're both currently kind of working through this. I see the wheels turning, and it is for me as well. But my general guess would be yes, he had some idea of the importance of salvaging all this, because I think, what would be the value of saving the stories that the skaldic poetry is based in? If you've got all the kennings, if you just have them, if you have what the skaldic poetry is, why wouldn't you just keep that? Why would you keep the basis behind it if all you're doing is mimicking?
No, that's a good point.
That's what. Yeah, I'm actually asking because that's like I also am still trying to think through this one.
And if I remember correctly, actually, I think some poets, at least in Iceland, later, I want to say late 14th century, perhaps. I'm not sure. That's a little bit beyond what I usually do. But a lot of skaldic poetry was starting to try and, like, at least a few skalds were trying to be a little more Christian about their kennings and their references, incorporating more Christian mythology. So it's kind of interesting when you bring up that, like, technically Snorri could have pushed people to be more Christian about their skaldic poetry, but he really was insistent that they maintain the older traditions when using new skaldic poetry, because that's what the whole Prose Edda was written for, was for contemporary skalds to recite new poetry using the same old traditions.
And the thing too is that he still could have theoretically understood the value of having, maybe say a cheat sheet so you get it right, though. Maybe just to play the other side a little bit, right? And I'm sure that's also what you're getting at a little bit here. So if the skald were to have this manual of at least how to do it correctly and how to recite things, and of course come up with new and novel poetry, because that would have been the idea, right? If you have that manual, then at least you can do it better and practice the art better. Maybe he was just a very he was wanting to be correct about things whilst maybe not understanding the meanings behind it. I think that would be the other side of the argument.
Yeah, and I think it is important to remember Snorri was a politician, and he I think when you think skaldic poetry was really important in the political sphere, especially with kings, and he went over to Norway quite a lot to schmooze with the kings over there. And it wouldn't be surprising if some of his motivation was really that political side of, you want to recite good poetry, which means you need to know how that good poetry is built up if you want to go impress kings and make a reputation for yourself. I mean, there's a practical side to it, I think, in his mind.
The funny thing, too, is I don't know which is better, because the whole thing here is that even if he's only writing things down kind of by rote, kind of by, this is the way it was, and here we're going to record it so that we can continue to use this poetry properly. What's the difference? What's the difference if compared to he actually understands what's going on in the meaning? And maybe another side to it as well is that, like you've mentioned before here, culturally, they would have effectively still been practicing everything to do with Norse religion except the bits that were replaced by Christianity and the bits that were so unsavory or in such opposition that they had to be removed from polite society explicitly. You know what I mean? They would have still had that culturally, though, right?
Yeah, and I think that brings me to an interesting memory I had. When last year, I had Dr. Robin Fleming come into one of my classes. She does early medieval England, almost late antiquity for England. But she made a comment once, is like, how can you really say when a population is Christian? Because when they're converted, they might believe they're Christian, but not be in line with the Christianity that, say, the Pope is emphasizing. And I think you could say to an extent the same about Icelandic society, because can we really assume that they were perfectly Christian to the standards that we think we have for them when they kind of decided for themselves in a national assembly that they were going to convert, and they were pretty much left to their own devices for almost 300 years after that. And the church was constantly having a difficult time gaining that power and political hold that they really should have had, and that some other European countries did have. And I think it's interesting how sometimes we do assume that, oh, their society was completely Christian by this point. It's definitely influenced by Christianity, and we definitely can't consider everything as being like, oh, this is a perfect preservation of pagan practice. I mean, everything has changed, and you can't take it for that in that kind of way. But it is important to mention that those older elements, including elements of folklore, especially, I think, really stick around. And it kind of seemed like that's what you were getting at to an extent, where it's not this, he's not really being that much of an overarching Christian mentality. It's a Christian mentality, but it's not that perfect one. And it's definitely been mixed with those older traditions that just are very stubborn and don't go away that easily.
And from what I understand, the decision to sort of convert to Christianity for a lot of the European, I guess I'll call them countries, at this time it was driven by trade, because the countries that were already Christian would not trade with a pagan nation. So, you know, we have this vision of Vikings as raiders, but they're also, you know, tremendous merchants and traders. So it was opening these new markets for them, and I think that part of the reason why that Iceland had after the conversion, they still had, you know, centuries of no real direct, I guess, control by the church. One is they're fairly isolated, but also it was done in a way to be able to trade with, you know, the other Scandinavian nations.
Yeah, and it's good that you bring that up, because when they were debating about converting, King Olaf threatened them directly by saying, if you don't convert, then all Norwegian ships are no longer going to come to Iceland. We're not going to trade with you. We're going to cut you off. And that would have been devastating for Iceland, because by then they were really relying on timber and more things coming from Norway. And without that connection, it would have been really, really difficult for them, because they had run out of a lot of materials, especially because they didn't really have much forest left. And grain production wasn't even that great to begin with. And it was only getting worse, especially after that period. But that economic hold that Olaf was able to pull, that card on them, that there definitely is more of a practical aspect to conversion as well. And if not everyone's hearts is actually in it, you know, you can't really assume that everybody was just immediately pure Christian, because there were so many other factors that went into conversion that we sometimes fail to remember. But it's a good thing that I think most people really are starting to realize that complexity of conversion now.
And even with the conversion and I guess after the 300 years, there's a church in Iceland, and I can't think of its name right now, but if you look at aerial photos of it, it looks very much like a Mjolnir, like a Thor's hammer that you would find in sort of like an archaeological dig. And I mean, I have zero evidence of this, but I always, whenever I see it, I wonder if this was kind of a, kind of like a joke that the Icelanders played on the Christians, or the kind of it's like, yeah, we've got this big church here, but if you look at it, it looks like Thor's hammer.
That would be really funny. I haven't heard of that though, but I'm kind of curious about it now. Though I know most medieval churches haven't actually survived, unfortunately, but it's still interesting to think about.
Well, the funny thing here, and this is it's also funny because this is just shows what I do in my spare time sometimes. I was just reading about all the different parts of a Christian cathedral, and I think I was interested in why everything was separated the way it was. But a Christian cathedral traditionally, at least in Gothic architecture, is shaped like a cross, and there's an area in the center that's sort of like the most holy place. It's where the cross, the horizontal and the vertical beams would intersect, and I mean, I'm certainly no expert in that, but it's rife with symbolic meaning for their purpose. And then if someone were kind of taking that and making it sort of like a Thor's hammer or something like that, I would at least guess that the symbolism would be kind of something to that,
Yeah, I just pulled it up on my phone here, and I'm going to destroy the pronunciation because languages are not my forte. But it's the Church of Hallgrímskirkja.
Oh, yeah, that's a much later build, but yeah, that's a good church. I never thought it was shaped like that.
Yeah,
cool.
it's a gorgeous building, and yeah, I'm looking at it right now, and it looks like if you were to go on Amazon and search like pendant of like Thor, or hammer of Thor pendant or something, there'd be a lot that would come up that looked like its profile. But yeah, so I mean, so even I actually don't know when this church was built, but
just this past the 20th century.
20th century. So even in the 20th century, there is I guess it'd be accurate to say the conversion has been imperfect. That conversions never get rid of all of the local belief systems.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say that you never have a perfect conversion, but of course, after that, I mean, after so much time goes by, you do have those revivals in scholarship, especially where they're like, especially after like the Enlightenment and stuff like that, where religion starts to get much shakier, and they end up realizing that there was all this stuff beforehand, and they really adapt it. But what's funny about that church too is that all the streets in front of it they're like named after the Norse gods. So like you have Loki and Thor and Odin. All the streets like right in front of it are all named after the old Norse gods, which is I always found funny.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's excellent. And you were just in Iceland,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, there's a Loki cafe right in front of that church, and I ate dinner there once right after seeing the church. It was pretty funny. Good food. Bit expensive.
Oh, awesome.
That's excellent. Do you mind telling us a little bit about your trip and what you were up to?
Oh,
there?
yeah, that's fine. So I was there to learn Icelandic, at least work on my Icelandic. I only spent a total of 3 days in Reykjavik. I spent the first weekend there. I just toured all the big monuments and saga things that I could find, like where there's like a little park for the first settler of Iceland, so I had to go see that. And I went to the museums, and they have a great museum from where they actually have the foundations of a house from the settlement period that I think if I'm remembering correctly, predates the arrival of the first permanent settler by like 2 years or so, or they think it might. It's kind of it's a really interesting museum, and you're right next to the foundations of the building. And I went to the National Museum, and if anyone is in Iceland, they definitely should go to the National Museum. I almost didn't, and I would have been beside myself if had I not, because when I went there, it was my favorite thing to see, because there were swords from the Viking Age. There were pieces like the little Thor figure that's really popular, where he's sitting on his throne with his beard, and it looks like his hammer. Mm-hmm. Though they do have that debate: could it be Christ? Could it be Thor? But they have that figure there, and that's really cool. And the Thor's hammer that looks like a cross. Really good finds that are there. But other than that, I spent most of my time in a very small place called Isafjordur, which has like 3,000 people. It was a very charming place up in the West Fjords. And I just spent most of my time learning the language. But it was a great experience. On the last week, I got to go to one of the sites where the saga, or Gisle saga, is supposed to have happened. And that was quite the experience. One of the things I like about Icelandic literature, and it usually doesn't have much mythology at all, unfortunately, but those sagas actually take place in the actual landscape. So you can go and really feel like you're where this happened. And of course, that's one reason why when Icelandic nationalism was unfolding and they were trying to get their independence, that a lot of people looked to the sagas and said, these were real. This was our golden age. You can stand here and say, this is where Gisli fell. This is where he was killed, or this is where he lived. And it's a really powerful thing to be able to do that. I felt bad because I was only there for an hour because my class, we had to leave with the bus. I could have stood there all day just thinking about what this could have been. It's quite the experience. And if anyone gets to go to Iceland, you have to go to some saga sites, because it's one of those experiences when you're just standing there thinking, this is where this could have happened. It's quite something, but it's really nice there. And they really are proud of their old traditions still. And they will definitely tell you about them if you ask.
That's great to know. That's on the bucket list for places to go for sure.
Mm-hmm. It's a beautiful place.
Yeah, definitely. And museums are one thing, but being able to get to go see that in the specific sites and all that, that's almost a whole other level. Mm-hmm. For sure.
Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't get to go where the Althingi was, the Thingvellir. I really wanted to go there, but I just didn't have the time. It would have been so great because so many things have happened there. And that was like the legal assembly site. And there were a couple pretty much skirmishes against each other there. It's just great, but I didn't get to go. So hopefully next time.
Yeah, by the sounds of it, you'll be back.
Oh, yeah. Hopefully. Hopefully not too long, but most of my research is on Icelandic material, so I'll probably have to go there anyway if I am fortunate enough to have the school pay for me this time. That would be nice. I was out of my own pocket this time. Loan money.
Well, there you go. Sometimes you got to make those sacrifices for those experiences, though, right?
Mm-hmm. It was worth it.
Sounds like it. Do you mind telling us a little bit about your research? Is that something you'd like to talk about?
Oh, yeah. Right now, I'm really into looking at how the Icelandic sagas treat aspects of material culture, especially ordinary objects. At the moment, I'm working towards my thesis for my master's, and I'm going to talk about, for one example, and it sounds ridiculous, and I never thought that I would be seriously saying this as a scholar, but I'm writing one of the chapters is about cheese, the significance of a piece of cheese. It sounds ridiculous, but when you actually start unfolding the layers of meaning that the story put into the cheese, you can get so much more out of it. And if anyone's familiar with Njal saga, once again, I bring this saga up a lot. You've probably noticed. There's a woman named Hallgerd who steals this piece of cheese while her husband's away. And say earlier that the previous winter, Gunnar, which is her husband's name, he was giving away all his food to people because there was a local famine. And he went to this other guy to ask for food because he gave away too much, because this guy had tons of food, and he refused Gunnar. And Gunnar just said, oh well, I'll just go home then, because he didn't want to start any fights. But his wife was not happy about that. And so she steals a piece of cheese, or steals not just one piece of cheese, but like 2 cartfuls of food. But the author specifically says cheese and butter. And of course, I'm starting to get lost in the weeds here of my research, but that's why you don't ask academics what their research is about. But when you really start to unfold it, it shows that the author is expressing an anxiety to his audience, or at least that's what I'm arguing, that women could use certain objects that they had a certain power over, because in Icelandic society, dairy production was mainly done by women. So this was something that she, as a woman, had kind of a association with and kind of a sort of power over, because she would be the one who made objects like this. And for the fact that the author specifically mentions, like, she stole cheese and butter, dairy products, while her husband was away at a legal meeting. She was exercising her power in her husband's absence. And the author is trying to make a comment about the anxiety that men had when they would leave home, and that their wives, if they had a strong enough personality, could use those forms of unexpected power to really make it, almost behave as a man would, to regain honor by force. So I like looking at how this literature uses ordinary objects to really express those deeper meanings, and how it's pretty much expressing the anxiety that men had over women and food, and the power they could wield through it. But that's just one little chapter of it. I'm hoping to use a couple other sagas. Unfortunately, no, I don't really think I'm going to use any mythological material, but perhaps it could be expanded to that if you look at it. It's kind of a methodological lens that I take, where I look at material objects and how certain stories use them, and how much they can say about the society, and based on how people are interacting with the object. It's good fun for me, but most people probably start to glaze over as soon as I start to tell the story. It's funny at first when I say cheese, but the details can kind of lose a lot of people.
I don't know. This is absolutely fascinating. Luke and I are here just like wrapped with attention, wanting to hear more. What other objects are you looking at?
Well, I'm thinking in another saga called Laxdæla Saga, I'm going to use a shirt and maybe a pair of pants, depending on where it goes. But there's a moment where like one of the characters makes a shirt that has a cut too low, so that for a certain man, to where you can see his nipples. And apparently, if you make a shirt in Icelandic society that can show a man's nipples, then it effeminates him and makes him seem like he's not man enough. So it's grounds for divorce. Then she uses it to divorce him, or to get someone divorced. And then you have this one woman who wears pants and acts like a man. And that's also apparently grounds for divorce. And there's just kind of this anxiety of like what people are wearing and how they are perceived, and how even their masculinity and gender is perceived through what they wear and how they act. And because one of the things about that woman who wears the pants, she actually takes vengeance for being divorced because of her fact of wearing pants. She actually takes vengeance with a sword herself and stabs someone over it. And it just really emphasizes the fact that when a woman wears pants, beware, because she can act like a man and stab you. And it's once again one of those anxieties, but it's kind of expressed through the fact that she wears pants. And most people wouldn't really think much of, oh, she wears a pair of pants. It's just kind of a mundane object to our eyes, because most of the time we're interested in those magical swords, those really cool cloaks, and gold arm rings. But sometimes when you look at a pair of pants, you can find more, or even cheese.
No, translating these, I suppose these aspects of the culture that wouldn't have, I don't know if necessarily, if I'm understanding you right, if even these people would have thought so much about them, but they would have understood the symbolism. You know what I mean? And that's the part that I think is very important for, anyone trying to understand the context, right? Is to understand these objects. It sounds like what you're doing is very valuable, and actually would be very interesting, at least for someone like myself.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah,
Phil wants to talk.
Exactly. I'm like, man, when are you going to turn? Because it's going to be your master's thesis, right?
Yeah.
And then those don't usually get published.
It depends. I think I've seen a few from my university that get published, but I honestly have no clue how the whole thing's going to work out. I'm just trying to get one day at a time right now.
For sure, as one does in their masters.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was just thinking, like, if it was PhD, it would definitely be published. That's sort of the point of it. And then other people like myself and Luke could, buy the book and read it. And I know this is actually, like, it's fascinating. I'm 100% sold on it. I'm on board. I would read this, definitely.
Well, that's great to hear, because most of the time people are just like, oh, that's cool, and then they walk away. No, I really want to expand this kind of like approach to material, and I kind of find myself doing it whether I want to or not. So I'm kind of hoping that one day I will I'll be able to do more than just like what I'm doing for the thesis, but I expand it to my, like, how I read some of the other things, like even the mythological material. Kind of depends if anything jumps out at me, because one of the most important things is you have to let the source inspire you. You don't make the force tell the story you want it to, but you have to read it with whatever ideas you come to it with, and just kind of let it speak to you. And whatever pops out is what you kind of jump on. And that's kind of what happened, because the whole idea with the cheese actually came together when I was chatting with one of my professors in her office hours. And suddenly we realized, like, that's not just a normal piece of cheese. There's something more to it. And it just kind of evolved from thinking, and I went and reread it, and I was like, yeah, actually. And here I am.
No, that's fantastic. And you make a distinction between the mythological material and the saga material, but it's all one and the same. I think you have to explore all of it to really get the best understanding. And I mean, again, that's one of the downsides to what we're doing, and the pace of what we're doing is that the sagas, it'll take longer for us to explore them in the level of detail that we want to. But it's the fact that you're not really looking at mythological sources for this stuff. I mean, that doesn't matter too much, because the sagas, they are, I think, just as valuable and important for understanding how the culture works and understanding the context, which is just as important to me for getting any meaning out of any of this at all, is understanding the context on at least a basic level, right? I mean, again, we're not experts by any means, but at a minimum, I think we've got a handle on some of the basics of how Norse society would have worked, and it really shows the value in understanding the history and why it's necessary to understand the history, to understand the mythology, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm really glad you brought it up, because most of the reason I'm making such an obvious distinction is mostly because modern readers, especially, don't always wander from the mythological material, which is where we really all start. I mean, I even read the Prose Edda before I read most of the sagas I've read. Most people don't wander over to the sagas that aren't as mythologically heavy. But I'm really glad you did bring it up, because even though a medieval audience would have definitely seen at least to some extent, would have perceived a difference in genre, they're all made, or at least a good amount of them are made at the same time and within the same culture. And you can't really divorce them completely, because it's the same culture, and in many aspects, even contemporary with other forms of literature. And that's why even when I'm reading the sagas, I have to consider, like, other influences that were in society at the time. Sometimes even continental romance to some extent or the other. That's definitely a touchy debate in the field, but like how much continental influence there was. But I won't get into that because it hurts my head. But it's good to I think we sometimes get too comfortable drawing such distinct lines between things, even between disciplines and fields and approaches. And I think it's much more rewarding when you cross over and you really see how things communicate rather than how they differentiate from each other. And I think we can really enrich ourselves more by looking at all these things in conversation rather than trying to divide them into nice little boxes. That makes it more convenient for us, but you really lose something when you do it like that. And I'm glad you brought it up that they really weren't in isolation from each other, and a lot of the material overlaps and a lot of the issues overlap that they explore.
Yeah, we're excited to get into the sagas one day, but that's still a ways off, unfortunately, just because of what we're doing. But again, that's what makes your work so valuable here, and I'm glad you've started up your podcast.
Yeah, I've been really enjoying podcasting, almost more than blogging, but I'm still going to definitely do both. But it's like I kind of almost did it on a whim. I was definitely inspired by Saga Thing. They're by far my favorite podcast. There's so many great podcasts, including yours, that really explores this material and presents it in a way that's just you can't get through a written post. And really just sharing the stories and talking about them. I think that's the most important thing about these projects is really sparking conversation, making people talk about them and think about them in ways that you wouldn't necessarily have if they just bought the book and read it by themselves. And that's why I'm really glad I'm still doing it. It's really in its infancy. I'm still kind of figuring out how I'm doing it and what I'm going to do with it. But I definitely don't regret it, no matter how much it sucks up my free time. It's really nice.
Well, I mean, for us as well, I think that's the whole thing. I mean, certainly it takes time, and it certainly sucks up a lot of that free time specifically. But it's worth it, and it's valuable. And I mean, on a selfish note, I mean, like I've personally learned just so much through the process of the podcast and all that. And I certainly wouldn't not take the time to do this. You know what I mean? It's valuable in and of itself for me on that end. And if it helps anyone else, well, that's just gravy as far as I'm concerned. If other people enjoy this, if other people listen to our ramblings and all that, I mean, that's just, I'm always overwhelmed actually when I hear that someone has listened to the show and enjoyed it. So I'm gonna guess you feel similarly something.
I'm right there with you. So. I'm always surprised when I get a really positive review and I'm like, wow, you really think of me like that? Because I just feel like a nobody just talking to a microphone and then I'm posting to myself. But it's amazing how some people come out. I've actually found I've gotten emails from people occasionally and they're like seeking advice and seeking help. And I find myself taken aback and I'm like, I'm really amazed that I can be here to help people because I'm out there just putting content out. It's something I love to do, and I learned so much about it. But it's amazing how much you can find that your work affects people and really helps people even.
Absolutely. And it always strikes me too, like when we get positive feedback that, it's the internet and positive things don't usually exist on the internet, right? Like it's, you generally expect someone to, I don't know, want to kill you in a weird amount of ways or call you, I guess Hitler would be the go-to insult on the internet, right?
Oh yeah.
So not having that has been unexpectedly wonderful.
Well, luckily with Norse mythology and the sagas, when you guys get there, you'll have plenty of creative ways to retort to such comments. Like I can think of many creative ways to, end people because of the sagas I've read. I mean, no one else would get the reference, but you could still make it and feel cool about yourself. And maybe a couple other people in your audience would be like, haha, yeah, I know where they're coming from. And it turns it on them.
Yeah. Well, no, but to be very clear though, you are definitely doing something valuable here. And, between your blog and your podcast, I mean, that's fantastic. And I mean, I hope that you have nothing but success in your academic career and, the things that you're working on eventually do get made available publicly because it sounds like some fantastic work. And of course, I'm assuming some of that is also going to translate into your blog and podcast. But, even everything you're doing academically, though, that sounds fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I really do appreciate the kind words for that. I'm not one of those people that has a very good ego. Even though in the field I'm getting into, you need a good combination of both an ego and humility, but I have a bit too much self-doubt. So I always really do appreciate when I have some positive feedback. And it means a lot to a lot of people like us, academics, or even just people who like us, again, who make content like this for what we feel like is a small number of people, but growing every day. Positive feedback really helps, and it really encourages us to do more. And I know when a lot of people advertise, like, give me a review on iTunes so I can be a better podcast. It's not just about the numbers. A lot of the times it's that positive moral support that really encourages us to keep making content, regardless of the numbers that we get. But those really positive comments really do a lot to fuel the fire.
Well, I think with that, how can people get in touch with you and leave those positive comments?
Well, I'm on a lot of different social media. You can send me a tweet. I'm on there more than I've ever expected I would be. I have a Facebook page, but that's like very dusty. I try my best to keep up with it, but it's in its infancy stages. I'm on WordPress, of course, and I'm also on Instagram, but that's more of a behind the scenes in my life than anything, but that could still be interesting in its own right.
They're all variations of Fjörn the Skald, right?
Yeah. Yes, they are. Fjörn's Hall, Fjörn the Skald, you'll find me. If I tried to regurgitate the actual addresses, I think it would more lose people than help people. I also have an email.
Oh, sure. No, we'll include links to everything you'd like to share in our show notes here.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate it.
Perfect. Do you have anything that you're currently working on or excited about that you'd like to talk about at all?
Or like to plug even?
I would like to plug. Well, I kind of keep my projects up in the air, and if I make promises, I might not be able to keep them. But I am hoping that in the next month or so, I'm going to do a post on the Landvættir, the land spirits. So I'm actually going to be touching on a little bit more mythological material, hopefully in the next podcast gathering. And I might do a Winter's Night post in October, which would be pretty cool.
Oh, fantastic.
But we'll see. It might also be about...
Yeah, regardless of whatever you decide to post about, I'm sure it's going to be the quality we've all come to know that you produce. So,
thank you. Hopefully, it gets better. I'm learning a lot as this process unfolds.
That's awesome. Well, I think that's about it on our end. So we'll just wrap things up. As I said at the beginning of the podcast. We've been speaking with Fjörn the Skald of Fjörn's Hall. He's got a podcast, he's got a blog, and we'll have links to all those in the show notes. Definitely check it out. Full of great information. I know I've had my mind blown a few times this interview, so it's been fantastic, and I'll definitely be checking more podcasts and more content on his Fjörn's website out. As for us, if you like the Northern Mist podcast, please review and share. You can go on iTunes, leave a review, and 5 stars would be fantastic. On YouTube, like, subscribe, share the videos. We're on basically every platform for podcasts. As well, you can share any of the posts that we make on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. And be sure to leave a comment. And, if there's something that you want to talk about, we're always interested in talking about this kind of stuff. If we've gotten something wrong, be sure to let us know, and we'll sort of figure it out from there. And you can reach us at Northern Myths Podcast on Facebook. Twitter is at Northern Myths. Luke is at North Myth Luke. I'm at North Myth Dan. On Instagram, it's at Northern Myths Podcast. And I think that's about it. Actually, I would like to also give a shout out. So I know Fjörn's Hall is on this as well, but we're sort of in this small but growing Viking community on Twitter called Going Viking. And you can check them out at Going Viking on Twitter. As well, we've been in touch with a lovely company that provides fantastic beard grooming items called the Viking Beard Company. On Twitter, they're at Viking_beard_co. And their website is vikingbeardcompany.co.uk. And they've got all the beard oils and combs and all that kind of stuff that you need, as well as other cool items. So definitely check them out.
Currently only shipping to the UK and the EU, but check them out regardless. And, maybe one day they'll be shipping internationally as well. But, for if you're in the UK or the EU, definitely take a look. They're great people making great products.
For sure. And the more people from North America who probably get in touch with them, like if the market is growing over here, chances are they'll start shipping over here. I mean, it's business 101, right? So definitely check them out. And then we'd also like to give a shout out to our friend Noah at History of Vikings podcast. Another great podcast. He's always got great interviews. You can check him out on Twitter at History of Viking. As well, there's the Viking Age podcast and the podcast, actually, Fjörn, that you had mentioned, your favorite saga thing.
Yeah, so between all these podcasts here, check them all out. We're all kind of in this together, and they're all complementary to one another. So, and obviously, we got Fjörn's recommendation for Saga thing there. So, yeah, between all these, always plenty to listen to, and you can find more information about all this stuff on the Going Viking page, their Twitter account.
And so that takes care of that. Am I forgetting anything, Luke?
Well, one last thank you to Fjörn. Thank you again for joining us. It's been a really great time speaking with you. It's been a great interview, and we hope to have you on again because this was a fantastic conversation. And the only other thing here is for all of us to go forth and find out what myth you're living.
This has been the Northern Mist Podcast. Thanks for listening.